Welcome everyone. My name is Anna Rose and I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for tuning in today for Cold War Spaces. This week's topic is pandemic space, medical knowledge and data organization. I'd like to welcome our guest, Andreas. He's professor for cultural studies at Leuphana University, Lüneburg in Germany. He's written and edited for German newspapers and contributes to Zeit magazine. His books include Lifted, A Cultural History of the Elevator from 2014, a book on reproductive technology also from 2014, and Persons of Interest, the status of the self in digital cultures. Also the triumph of profiling, the self in digital culture, and a book about the hashtag symbol from 2019. And today he'll be speaking about the history of explaining pandemics and the use of contagious diseases as metaphors in political and cultural discourses before, during, and after the Cold War. Today's program will be about a 30-minute discussion between Andreas and Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, there'll be about 15 minutes for Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. We appreciate everyone's questions, but please keep them short so that we can try to get to everyone's. And for any other discussion or comments from the audience, please use the chat box. It's open today. And as we're getting started, feel free to say hi and what city you're tuning in from. We'll be posting the recording of this program on our Vimeo page afterwards and also in podcast format on our SoundCloud. And lastly, I want to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now Yus will get us started with the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. And Andreas, welcome to Cold War Spaces. Wonderful to have you here. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
No, absolutely. And let me start with a rather personal question. So Anna Rose mentioned some of your publications, among other things, the history of the elevator, the self in the digital age, the hashtag. How would you describe your journey, your academic journey from there to the history of pandemics? I'm also asking because usually scholars are very much sticking to the subject, but we have an enormously wide range of topics, it seems.
I think subject-wise, I can't give a sensible connection between the different books or different interests. So I can't draw a line very easily from the elevator to reproductive medicine to the digital self to the history of pandemics. So it's a wide range subject-wise, but I think the connection is on the level of method. I think I always used a similar method in these books because at the beginning there was a certain interest on constellations or phenomena of the present. For example, like the elevator as a totally normal means of transportation, or reproductive medicine as a very as the state of the art of reproduction in the present, or the digital self, which is obvious like a category of the present, and now the pandemic. And then I go back in history and try to find certain prehistories or a certain genealogy of these developments. And I'm asking what was the condition in medicine or biology which made it possible to create babies outside the female body? Or right. What was the condition of something like a profile in social media? If you think back 25 years ago, only serial killers had a profile made by the FBI. Now everybody has a voluntary profile. Or now the pandemics, what we have been facing in the last 12, 13 months, what can we learn from history, from previous epidemics in comparison to the ways and techniques like we deal with a pandemic now? And so I think method-wise, it's not so far away. A book on the elevator, on the digital self and the pandemics. But of course, the subjects are pretty heterogeneous, I have to admit.
Yeah, it sounds like you are combining the approaches of a journalist and a historian in a very creative way. So let's talk about your current research project, which is not just about the history of pandemics, but also quite specifically about how to talk about them. how to narrate them. And can you tell us a little bit why you think that aspect of narration is so central in the history of pandemics?
Yes, I think if you look back on the last year on COVID, and if you also look back in a wider range on the history of epidemic diseases, let's say since the 18th century, since the smallpox and then cholera or polio, diphtheria, you have always the same impression that fighting epidemic diseases is a fight with two faces. On the one hand, you have medicine, you have the history of vaccination, you have the history of processes of immunization to fight diseases, like in the last 12 months, like the search for a vaccine. And on the other hand, you can say that at least as long you are succeeding with the vaccine in this process, it's absolutely crucial to represent the disease in an understandable way. So if you think back the last 12 months, especially in the first 6, 8, 9 months, when there was not a vaccine at hand, the most important thing for fighting the disease were data. Every day in the news, every evening on TV, for example, in Germany, we have the press conferences every evening shown on TV by the Institute for Epidemic Diseases. And there are a lot of statistics, there are a lot of tendencies, there are a lot of trials to understand something which is called in German the Infektionsgeschehen, which in English is maybe something like infection activity. And so that is like the core of my interest, to combine the medical approaches to fight a disease with the methods of data organization and data narration to fight a disease.
Right, so would you say that in order to be effective, medical doctors should actually look at the practice of historians who are always confronted with this challenge to translate data into a story?
Yes, and if you go back to the 18th century, to this century where epidemic diseases were for the first time fought, you can say, in a modern way. So the beginning of a certain type of vaccination called the inoculation against the smallpox was brought to Europe in the 1720s. And you can say smallpox, especially then in the end of the 18th century, when the vaccination itself with the cowpox came in, from this time on, you can see that the whole science of data organization, let's say the early times of population statistics or something like this, demographics, they were always triggered by epidemics. So you can say in the history of data organization, in the history of statistics, diseases, epidemic diseases like smallpox or later cholera and now COVID are the most important impulses, the most important could you say, the most important triggers for new forms of data organization. And think about the COVID apps, you know, like the COVID app is this new state of the art of data organization in a city, for example. Every person you have contact with is shows up in the COVID app. And again, you can say in the present, you have the same tendency as in the 18th century. The epidemic disease brings up new forms of statistical knowledge.
Right. And how would you say that explanations of epidemics and the way we talk about epidemics changed in the late 19th and early 20th century with the discovery of bacteria and viruses? What kind of impact did that have?
Yeah, for me as a lay person in the history of epidemiology, this was one of the most important and the most fascinating things which came across, and I tried to make it very, very short and very easy to understand. But you can say that in the 1870s, 1880s, when bacteriology came up for the first time, and when the microbes were discovered, so to speak, by Louis Pasteur in France and by Robert Koch in Germany. This was the end, you can say, of a 2,000-year-long argument between two theories of infection. And the one theory, you could say, was proven right by bacteriology, because the one theory said, already in the ancient Greek and Roman medicine, that there's a contagion. There's like a little tiny material substance of contagion, which comes from person to person and develops epidemic disease. And this was, you can say, proven right by bacteriology. But the other theory, which also came across in the ancient Greek medicine, was far more powerful, especially in the 19th century. And this theory was called the miasma theory. And the miasma was a certain, you could say, atmosphere in the air coming from unhealthy living conditions, or from unhealthy lakes, unhealthy waters in the city. And this atmosphere kind of poisoned a certain part of the population. This was the other infection theory. So not a contagion, but something like an atmosphere. And you immediately can imagine that as long as the miasma theory was the more important theory, the reactions to a pandemic or an epidemic was totally different, because if you have miasmas, you don't need a quarantine. You don't need like an interruption of distribution, because there is no contagion between man and man. And so you can say bacteriology from the 1870s on brought in the kind of reaction to a pandemic, which is now totally, you can say, natural for us. You know, everybody has forgotten in the 21st century that bacteriology or virology are pretty young sciences. Right. They are only 100 to 150 years old. Now we say, if somebody coughs or if somebody speaks very, very, very loudly, then the next person is prone to being infected. But this is a comparatively new model if you go back to the 18th, 17th, 16th century. And so you can say bacteriology changed in a very, very radical way the ways how we conceive and how we talk about infection.
Right, interesting. I would say another aspect of talking about contagious diseases is how they are sometimes used as a metaphor in cultural, social, and political discourse. For instance, well, a famous example, of course, is during the Third Reich, the association of the Jews with contagious diseases, but also during the Cold War period, for instance, some Soviet art critics speaking about Western art in terms of degeneration, but also in the United States, for instance, Congressman George Dondero calling modern art, American modern art, art from termites and germ-carrying art vermin. So there are so many of those examples. How do you see the introduction of contagious diseases in those more general discourses with very clear political aims?
Yeah, this is a very, very interesting question you're posing. And I think it's not forbidden, and it's not, let's say, a construction to draw this relation you have just done, to draw a relation between the origins of bacteriology in the 1870s and the Third Reich. Mm-hmm. And of course, everybody knows that the poison in the gas chambers was a poison for vermin, right. You know, and this is like the last deadly consequence of a metaphoricity or of a certain way to talk in a metaphorical political way, which immediately has started when the microbes were developed or founded in the 1870s. And for example, Robert Koch, the famous German bacteriologist, which everybody still knows. He was a cruel nationalist. And he used in the late 19th century in his papers and in his books on bacteriology and on epidemics, he used all the new terms of bacteriology, like the microbe, vermin, the vermin which is in German eingeschleppt from another country into Germany. I mean, in English you could say introduced, but it's not as a sharp
Intruder,
term.
maybe.
And an intruder, right.
Yeah.
And Robert Koch immediately linked the new science of bacteriology to a political nationalist argument when he said diseases, epidemic diseases, they tend to come from the east, like from the filthy, dirty east, you know, Eastern Europe. There was also an anti-Semitic connotation to this very early, and so a country like Germany has to, you know, has to try really to keep itself safe from this intruding.
Right.
And if you remember what I have said 5 minutes ago about this old theory, the miasma theory, this theory was not prone to nationalistic symbolicity, because if you say there's a certain atmosphere which is poisoned because of bad hygienic conditions, you don't have an outsider, you don't have an alien, you don't have an intruder. So you could say bacteriology from the very beginning on was very, very much prone to chauvinism and to nationalism.
Right. Do you feel that this kind of reasoning is still being used in our time?
That's a good question. I mean, if you think about how people in the West, I can only talk for Europe because unfortunately I haven't had the chance to be in the US since COVID. I don't know how it was in the US, but I remember what the former president said in the year 2020 about the origins of COVID. So you know, China was like the new Eastern Europe of the early 20th century, you know, and China in relation to Western civilization was again used as like the bad alienated exotic state where the bacterium or the microbes came from. So it's still, you could say, it's still pretty much a similar metaphorical story.
Right. So during the Cold War years, would you say that there is a marked difference in the approach of pandemics and how people speak about pandemics in the East and the West, for instance, in East Germany and West Germany? And,
yes, this again.
And if there is a difference, was that ideologically motivated or not at all?
This again was one of the most fascinating parts of my research so far, because when I read some historical sources about the discipline of vaccination in Western Germany and Eastern Germany in the second half of the 20th century, it was very, very interesting to see that a socialistic country like East Germany or like the Soviet Union, they connected let's say the ideology of the collective in a socialist way to the discipline in vaccination. And they said, look at us, we Eastern Germany, we have a discipline of, let's say, 90% of the population which has already been vaccinated against diphtheria or against polio in the 1950s. And look at the decadent Western Germany. They are so individualistic. Only 20% of the people there have been vaccinated against polio, for example. And it's very interesting if you study the sources in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, that the danger of epidemic diseases and the discipline of the population was always used as something like an advertisement for socialist ideology. And there even was a slogan. Another historian who wrote a book on vaccination, he found a slogan in the GDR, which said, how do you say in English, prophylaxis?
Right.
Prophylaxis is socialism. Socialism is prophylaxis. So you can see that epidemic diseases and their cures are kind of a lackmus test for socialism. And yeah, I think that's very interesting.
Right. So you mentioned that your research interests are usually start from the current time, from the present. So let's talk a little bit about the present too, in terms of our pandemic. One of the remarkable characteristics, I think, is that there are such different views of the pandemic and such different responses in different parts of the world, and sometimes in different countries, or in the case of the United States, even on state level, very different approaches. Do you feel that those differences are motivated by political or cultural considerations, or how do you interpret this variety of responses?
I think you still can, I mean, although after 1989, like the competition between the two basic political systems of the 20th century has, as everybody knows, has vanished. But I think you can still see the traditions. So if you see how some Asian countries, some former communist Asian countries deal with the pandemic, and if you compare it, for example, to Europe or the US, you could still find, I would say, some traces of what I have said just a couple of minutes before about the relation between Western Germany and Eastern Germany in the Cold War period. So you still have, I would say, you still have this general threshold or this general trace between a more individualistic tradition, which could also be seen as a more decadent tradition. And on the other hand, a tradition of the collective, a tradition of discipline, which puts the success of a collective higher than, let's say, the pursuit of happiness of the individual. Right. So this, I think you can still trace, but I think there's a new tendency, at least in a country like Germany. There's a new tendency insofar as, for example, in social media, on Twitter, or also in newspapers, in traditional newspapers, you find a sometimes irritating, sometimes disturbing envy towards a country like China. And you often have, and this for me personally, it's kind of irritating that, especially also from the political, from the political left, there are a lot of voices in Germany in the last month which say, why don't we do it like China? Why don't we do it like South Korea? And we have a very, very hard lockdown for a couple of weeks and then it's over. Why do we, why do we digress so much in our soft lockdowns? And I think this is an interesting sign because, as you know, in the US and in Europe, we have the same cultural arguments at the moment. There's a new kind of authoritative left, you could maybe say, which kind of raises its voice for following the very authoritative methods, let's say, of some Asian countries. And this is a new tendency, I would say.
I see. So you're more in favor of the individualistic approach, or?
No, I would not dare to give any general advice, not at all. Right. I mean, I really would never dare to say something general how you would do it. No, because I mean, the thing I would say maybe is I'm very disturbed by the amount of people in a country like Germany, but maybe also in a country like the US. I'm very disturbed by the amount of people who deny scientific knowledge about the pandemic and about vaccination. So this is maybe, this is a thing I could dare to say. That's for me very, very disturbing.
Yeah, so let me ask a question about that, because I'm wondering whether since the 18th century, people always have been hesitant to receive vaccinations. And if you think that with COVID-19, the arguments not to get a vaccine differ from historical arguments.
Yeah, as you said, I mean, this was also new for me, and it's maybe also new for most of the people listening to us to this afternoon. I was surprised that the history of the anti-vaccination movement is exactly as long as the history of vaccination. So I mean, right. This is something surprising maybe in the first view. And when this first form of vaccination came up, called inoculation against the smallpox in the 1720s, the main reason of the anti-vaccination movement was that it would kind of disturb it was a theological argument. So vaccination would disturb the theological order of healing people. You know, if you get a vaccination, then God's plan, who dies and who survives, is kind of weak. So this
was not involved in developing the vaccination.
Right. So this was the first argument against vaccination in the 18th century came from a religious side. And you could say this is over. But the first peak of the anti-vaccination movement in Europe was in the late 19th century, when countries like Germany or England had a new rule for vaccination. So everybody had to be vaccinated against smallpox in the late 19th century. And then there was a huge movement. And the arguments then already remind very much of our current arguments. So for example, like the big natural movement around 1900, the movements for natural living, for natural health, they said that vaccination is kind of an artificial and dangerous artificial means of curating diseases, and should be substituted by something like a natural healing which comes from within the body. And this reminds me very much of the arguments today, for example, of the anti-vaccination movement. So there are kind of, there's a continuity between, let's say, the late 19th century and today. And that's very interesting, I think.
Right. So we are about to move to the Q&A, and you can all put your questions in the Q&A box. But before we go there, I would like to ask you one final question, and that is about the political contestation of wearing masks and things like that. That seems to me a relatively new kind of argument. How did vaccinations and the fight against COVID in this case become a political issue?
Yes, I would connect it to a media technological argument maybe, because I would say the thing which has been a big subject in the last 5 or 10 years in a strictly political sense, that the public sphere has been fragmented by social media. So 20 years ago, everybody took a look in the same newspaper, everybody took a look at the same TV program, and now everybody has its own specific look on its own specific timeline on social media. And this fragmentation of the public sphere, which has been described a lot of times in the last years, now I would say proves right in the ways how the pandemic has led, as you said, to a lot of political contestations, because everybody has their own sources of information, everybody has their own sources, what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong. And maybe COVID is like the first example of how a big global crisis kind of shatters in a lot of tiny fragments and leads to a lot of contestations, because the public sphere has been fragmented so much. I would bring together these two developments very, very tightly. And you know what? Final sentence to this. When I studied in my research now the early history of HIV and of AIDS, I always thought to myself, wow, what would have been the case if 1980 already social media existed? Right. Because everybody who's a little older remembers how hysterical and how almost mad people were in finding suspects of the spread of HIV, and the anti-gay movement and the anti-homosexual movement in the early 80s against HIV. And remember what would have been the case if there had been already Facebook. Yeah. And this is maybe an interesting question. How do contemporary media technological developments shape the ways people talk about a pandemic?
Right, right. Thank you. Yeah. We have a question from Bruce Hollihan, and he writes, I appreciate very much your work with ideas, methods, and things to reach a better and healthier life. To what extent are the various anti-science and anti-intellectual movements, such as accelerationism, which is advocating total collapse of political and social order, taken as seriously as threats like diseases and viruses?
I did not understand I did not understand the connection between accelerationism and virus and diseases. Could you maybe repeat?
I think the question is about that connection. So to what extent are the various anti-science and anti-intellectual movements, such as accelerationism, taken as seriously as threats like diseases and viruses?
Yeah, I mean, this fits very well to the last question we have discussed, right, exactly, you and me. And I would say that, this is maybe already, could maybe be an answer to it. So I would say the contemporary media technological situation has led to a fragmentation of what is true, what is false in a scientific sense. And I would say the whole sad debate in the last 4 or 5 years about something like fake news could only have been developed in an age of fragmented media, and in an age of that a Twitter account can be the most important news source of a president of a big country. And I would say, but this is, I think this is discussed very widely, so this is nothing new. But I would say this disturbing skepticism against scientific truth, for example, in the moment against scientific truth about a virus, about a pandemic, has to do with this media technological shift.
And would you say that is something generally true for specialists in any field at this moment, that they are just not being trusted and followed anymore as much as they used to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very hard question if you say how it used to be, because then you would have to look very, very precisely on former historical constellations, and maybe the answer would be it was always very problematic in different shapes. But of course you could say if you see the doubt of very, very many people against the statements of very prominent virologists or epidemiologists at the moment, Yeah, you can see this in Germany, you can see this in the US. This is really very disturbing. And I think you can bring it together, but it would be the same point now. I don't want to repeat myself. I think you have to bring together with the contemporary system of information and media.
Right. Since at this point we don't have other questions in the Q&A box, I'm using the opportunity to ask you some other questions I'm very curious about. And one is then also more maybe of a metaphorical character. So in order to fight the pandemic, we have to sometimes quarantine ourselves and shield ourselves from others. There is also a country that does that, North Korea. Would you say that the argumentation of the North Koreans to not be infected by influences from other parts of the world is actually comparable to the rhetoric used in pandemic diseases? Or
yeah, I mean, this is almost a question which kind of sums up all the subjects and questions we have talked about in the last 45 minutes, because there maybe everything comes together what was of interest now in the conversation between us and what is of interest in my book, in my upcoming book, that it's so interesting that that the epidemic disease or the task of immunization really always brings together literal and metaphoric levels. And I think North Korea is a very good example, because you could say if there was what you can call a cultural immunity of North Korea against the proliferating Western decadence, you could say that North Korea maybe was one of the last islands of immunization in a sense of let's say communist ideology.
Right.
And now a global pandemic is kind of a test how this cultural immunity is linked to the literal immunity in a medical way. And I mean, the big bias maybe is that we don't have reliable data of the situation in North Korea, because this is part of the constellation that they are so they are so abgeschottet. How would you say in English? They are so isolated,
right?
That of course you don't have reliable data. But if it's true that they have suffered from COVID in a very, very lowest level than most of the other cities, then it's really interesting in combining political, cultural, and medical perspectives or constellation. And yeah, but this is the thing, that immunity, and maybe I can say 2 or 3 sentences about this. Immunity in the history of this term has always combined, in a very, very interesting sense, medical and cultural shades of meaning. For example, in the there is a great book about classic literature, German literature, like Goethe and Schiller, and that the whole poetics of literature have been shaped as immunity. So there's a famous quote by Schiller that tragedy, his tragedies on the theater, are a vaccination against affects. So if you have like affects like big love and big passion, and you only want to think about it, but not live it, not leave your wife for another girl, then you go in the theater and look tragedy by Schiller, and then you're vaccinated, by passion and your imagination, and then you're immune, and then you don't do it in life.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and this is a big, in the history of literature, this idea has always been brought up, also in modern literature, that literature is a vaccination, because you have like very, let's say, passionate, very dangerous, very standards, living standards, imaginations in reading or in watching movies. And when you have done it, you don't need it in real life. So it's so art is a vaccination.
Great. We have a few other questions in the meantime. The next one asks, do you think the COVID-19 pandemic could help bring socialized medicine to the United States?
Unfortunately, I'm not a specialist in the political medical condition of the United States. What would you mean exactly by socialist medicine? You know,
socialized medicine.
Yeah, socialized.
I don't know. Maybe
for example, like the
insurance and general health insurance or something like that.
Yeah. If this is meant by the question, it's a great question, because from a European perspective, this has always been a surprise that the general health insurance in the US is so poorly developed by intention, of course. And so this is a great question, if I understood it correctly, that maybe something like a global pandemic could enhance the concept of health insurance for everyone in the US, because now you really see, I don't know, as I said, I can't say anything about the US because I don't know enough, but from what we are reading in Germany about the situation in the US, then maybe it's true that COVID has shown that it's maybe sometimes dangerous, that health insurance is not there for everyone, right? Could you say this? Yeah.
No,
and then the question is very, very wise. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question. Can it be that the challenge of individualistic Western societies to keep their populations healthy requires a modification and perhaps temporary cessation of individualism in an effort to contend with the pandemic?
Yeah, this is almost a socialist question. Yeah, I mean, in the history of a pandemic, it's an old term, because global epidemic diseases since the late 19th century always questioned individualism, and global epidemic diseases always had something like an apocalyptic connotation, in the sense of, you know, this is like the very, very old model of explaining diseases. It's what is Strafe in English, Jos? It's
punishment.
It's a punishment, right? The very old, as everybody knows, the very old explanation of the plague, for example, was it's a punishment of God, right, for our inadequate lifestyle. And I think this model has been saved through 2000 years. And if you think about COVID, how many times people said climate change, like the whole tragedy of climate change has now led to something like COVID as, let's say, the last means for us to understand that we have to change our life. Yeah. So this has been, at least in Germany, has been a very, very regular sentence or statement. And in this statement, you still have this old idea of the global disease as a punishment of, not of God maybe, but of like of natural wisdom or something.
Right, yeah. So we are at a time that I can't resist the temptation of asking you one last question, since you brought up climate change. You could argue that in order to really effectively fight the pandemic, global collaboration would have been great, but it wasn't there. For effectively fighting something like climate change, we also need global collaboration. Do you think that the response to COVID throws a pretty dark light on our wish, maybe even, or our ability to engage in global collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, I really would like to end this this talk with something like an optimistic
that would be nice.
outlook. That would be nice.
Yeah, right.
But as you already, you know, implicitly mentioned, it seems that COVID has shown that it's very, very, very difficult for the different countries and for the different politicians in the countries to work together on such a global crisis. But to try to put it in an optimistic way for the rest of the afternoon in Los Angeles and for the rest of the evening here in Berlin, we could say maybe that like COVID was something like a not so good last test for the absolute serious case of climate change, where the collaboration of different countries hopefully is getting better and more sensible than it has been now in the last year.
Great, and on that optimistic note, Andreas, I want to thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating and insightful presentation and interview. Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it very much, and thank you for your great questions. This was really wonderful, and thank you for all the listeners here. And yeah, have a nice afternoon. It was great to talk to you, Jos.
Thank you. So next week we have our next Cold War Spaces interview with Russian artist and children's book writer and illustrator Eugene Yelchin, who will talk about his early life in a kommunalka, a communal apartment in Leningrad, present-day St. Petersburg, and how his artistic career started underneath the dinner table of his grandmother, where his bed was situated and where he scratched his early drawings on the underside of the table. So hope to see you there, and I wish you all a wonderful week.